Welcome back to the Leadership Caffeine podcast. It is my pleasure to introduce, and Thomas, I apologize ahead of time if I don't get this right, Thomas Wedell-Weddellsborg, the author of What's Your Problem? To Solve Your Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve. Thomas, it's great to have you here.
Thanks so much. And also thanks for having an easier name to pronounce than mine art.
I've been fretting. I lost some sleep over that name pronunciation. But I have to tell you, I actually lost more sleep over staying up reading your book. I love the book. I think it's fabulous. It's timely given the world that we're in this notion of finding ways to strengthen our ability to understand the problems we're trying to solve. It just seems to be, again, timely, spot on for where we're at. I do have to ask you, though, so it's a logical first question. What problem are you trying to solve with this book?
Yeah, it really came from my work with companies, with clients, just my gradual realization that people weren't very good at this thing about understanding the problems they're trying to solve. And so it struck me that there's just a gap in our collective toolbox around thinking about problems. We're good at thinking about solutions. We're not so good at going in and rethinking the questions or the problems we're trying to solve. So that was really the impetus for it. I'm trying to solve the problem of making the world better at problem solving, if you will.
I think that's absolutely both noble and fabulous and much needed. So, and you the book is ostensibly about framing and reframing, challenging us to rethink in this concept of reframing. And I found it fascinating. You had mentioned that you spend a lot of time, delivering workshops and teaching companies and consulting with companies, and you regularly hear positive feedback on this is great, and that upsets you.
Yes, wow. That's insane. Well, think about it. I mean, we know from, this is an old idea, reframing. It's been with us for a long time. We know from a lot of research that's been happening in this that it's very powerful. And I'm a little bit, I despair a little bit whenever I go out into a company full of really talented people, and they go like, oh, this was great. This is, I've never heard of this before. This will be really useful. I'm like, why haven't you heard of this before? This is stuff we should be teaching people at entry level or earlier. The basic skill of when I think about how much time and money and energy we are wasting solving the wrong problems, I'm like, why aren't we better at this? I should ideally be out of a job in 5 years if I succeed with this, at least teaching reframing to people, if you will. I don't know if you've seen something similar in your work. How for the clients you work with, how widespread is it?
I would concur with your perspective, because I find most of my time when I'm coaching or when I'm working in strategy consulting, it's literally a constant process of rethinking, reframing. My verbiage isn't as quite as good as yours, but I'll say, hey, let's look through this at a different lens. So that might be my tactic for getting people to try to see things differently. But I'm constantly doing that, and the epiphanies that they seem to have from thinking through it, with that different frame, never cease to amaze me. So I'm kind of with you. I'm wondering why we don't teach this in school, maybe start in preschool or kindergarten or something to that.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is I think actually the education system nowadays have started getting, more into this. If you look at some of the work of, I think it's the folks who did the right question framework, Lou Santana and Dan Rothstein, they went in and there are some frameworks in education where we're starting to teach kids this now. That's of course not that helpful if you're an adult and you're not going back to school anytime soon.
Right.
I think it's just been a missing piece. And I as you may know from reading the book, I actually tried to teach this to a bunch of 5, 6, and 7-year-olds at one point. And they actually, the 5-year-olds, they're too young. But the 7-year-olds, they started getting elements of it. Yeah, so I think this is not something, you don't have to wait until your university years or whatever. This is something you can teach people to do gradually.
So, I confess to having a little bit of a guilty feeling. I often have that guilty feeling when I read books, and it's like, I don't know why I didn't think about why. I want to think about these things before. So I work with people quite a bit on the process of decision making. And there's certainly a flow and a structure, and you have to watch for the cognitive biases, and there's all sorts of different guidance. But I can actually think about many instances where we didn't spend enough time trying to look at the problem we were striving to solve. And that was that sense of guilt that I got through that there. I think it happens a lot.
It does. It is just so common to see, the way people get trapped in a framing. They come in and they say to you as a coach, hey, I have this option. Should I do A or B? Mm-hmm. And they never really question if there's is there an option C or D? Or even, what problem are you trying to solve? And is that the right problem?
Yeah. They often don't break the frame, I think, in your vernacular. But so before we get too far into the process of framing and learning how to do it in reframing, can you give us a simple example? There's some fabulous ones in the book. You pick one.
Yeah, the one I always love sharing is the slow elevator problem. And you basically imagine that you're the owner of an office building and the tenants are complaining about the lift or the elevator that it's too slow. Now, that's framed for you already. And so many people just go, oh, the elevator is too slow. The solution is to make it faster. And then they spend all their creative energy on figuring out how to do that.
Right.
Whereas if you go in and ask landlords what they typically do, well, they take a very different approach. Namely, they try often putting up a mirror in the hallway. And that's not a solution to making the elevator faster. That's a solution to a different problem, namely that people notice and are annoyed by the wait. So it's just such a vivid, memorable example of the idea that sometimes the way to solve a problem is not to try to solve it, but actually to try to stay in the problem space for a second and try to say, is there another way of thinking about this problem, of what's going on? Is there a better problem to solve?
Is that an example of breaking the frame?
It could be, depending on where you take it. So the idea of breaking the frame, I came up with that term because I noticed that when people are looking for clues or ways to think about a problem, we tend to default to digging into the problem before. So it's almost as if we have in front of us, like, the elevator is slow.
Right.
And our natural tendency is to go deeper and say, why is it slow? Is there a factor in there that we haven't considered? Mm-hmm. Breaking the frame is important because that's about stepping away from that first framing, not being trapped in it, and asking instead, is the speed of the elevator really the thing to focus on here? Or is there something else going on? Could this be a ploy to negotiate a lower rent? Could it be they're really unhappy with the current super in the building, and now this is bubbling up as a reaction to that? Could it be that our contracts are too easy to break, if people are threatening to leave the building with them and so on? So that's a crucial skill, because people, even the best problem solvers, can so easily be trapped by whatever way the problem happens to be framed at first. Tell people the elevator is slow, they'll go in one direction. Tell people the tenants are unhappy, and they'll go in a different direction. So this is,
Yeah, I mean, isn't that an example? So I run into it all the time with clients where the boss steps up and said, hey, we've got, to the team, we've got a problem here. Yeah. So suddenly that's effectively a framing, and the boss views it as a problem, and we're going to have one set of solutions. Whereas if that boss had said, hey, we've got, here's a situation, and then let the team frame it as a positive and develop solutions, and frame it as a negative. So I see that boss framing in play all of the time.
Yeah, and it's you're bringing up a complication with framing. Is like, if you're lucky, you're kind of working in a neutral environment where you can speak freely. There's psychological safety.
Sure.
More often you're dealing with a boss or a client or somebody who's coming in and effectively forcing a framing on you.
Right.
And that puts extra kind of burdens on you to be good at navigating that, because not only do you have to try to reframe it, you also have to work through their resistance. Like, they might come in, why are we talking about the problem? Let's keep moving. Or you're a vendor. Why are you give me the solution I want.
You were in that meeting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very common. And I think there is I think of there being two levels of solutions to it. The one is really the big picture one that I hope that this idea of reframing and its importance can just be spread out globally, because this will become a ton easier if your boss or your client, when you say, hey, can we try to reframe the problem? They know what you're talking about. And they may not be good at it, but they'll accept it. Versus, the situation most people are in now, where they have to find sneakier ways of kind of working with the client or the boss to kind of, almost be allowed to come in and have an opinion about the problem.
Right.
So to speak.
So before we move too far from the elevator example, I think you'll find it amusing. So I've had the book for a few weeks, and I've loved going through it. And I showed you pre-call there. The Post-its are just sticking out of it all over the place. And I have two different groups of fitness professionals.
Ooh.
And I bounce the problem off of them, the elevator problem, with attribution to you. And I think you give attribution to someone else within the book, so where you originally encountered it. And guess what their answer was? Fitness professionals.
Take the stairs?
Absolutely, to a person, to a group, take the they said it so fast it made my head spin. So
well, but that's an amazing example, right? Because this shows something else about problem framing, that we tend to have a favored solution. No surprise that fitness people say, you have a problem in your family, you should exercise more. It's kind of like, wait, what?
It's almost the classic example of the child with the toy hammer, right? They're going to look at pounding on everything in that case.
Exactly. I mean, that's you're referring to Abraham Kaplan's, if you give a boy a hammer, he'll, everything he sees will need pounding.
No doubt. No
absolutely.
doubt.
And which, by the way, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you want multiple different people involved in this. You're going to get a better framing or thinking around your problems if you have people in the room that aren't all the same profession or don't all think alike. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest arguments for diversity is really that people with a different viewpoint, different experiences, they can just help you, see your own blind spots much faster than you can, or a group who's all alike.
Somewhere, and I don't recall if it was in your Harvard article or in the book, you had referenced, and I believe it was a quote from somebody who said, "Beware of tools."
Yeah, that's one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, and he has this expression in his series, The Sandman, where he says, "Tools are the subtlest of traps." That just stuck with me, because we create tools for ourselves, checklists, whatever processes we have. And we do so because they help us. But at some point, you also a little bit you rely on the tool so much that you forget to think. And I've seen sometimes, if I give people a very rigorous checklist with 40 questions, they will race through it. They won't actually really think about what's going on. They won't necessarily ask, well, is there a 41st question we really should be asking?
Right.
So I struggle with it, because we do need tools, but it is that awareness that the tool is not the entire thing. The tool shouldn't replace thinking. It should be an aid to thinking.
So I was fascinated by that quote from him on a number of levels. First of all, is it fair or unfair to say that you're kind of giving us a set of tools with your wonderful book here?
That's not unfair at all. And the way I think about it is, I've seen other people try to approach this question of framing exactly through a very, wouldn't say complex, but elaborate process, where you go in and you have, the 40-point checklist and so on. What I tried to strip it down to, the way I tried to handle this, was really just to teach it as a very simple habit of mind. It's almost the process of going in and saying, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Let's quickly try to rethink it, and then let's move forward. Mm-hmm. And then you can kind of take all your favorite tools, if you have them, and stuff into that process. Like it's whatever questions have you found helpful, say, in your coaching practice, for instance, you can kind of fit that around it. It's almost more the habit of mind that I want to create than necessarily the checklist. It's not a perfect solution, but I found that has worked best for the clients I've kind of taken through this over the last 6 or 7 years.
So a couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of connecting on a podcast interview with Jeffrey Moore, who's the famous Silicon Valley consultant of Crossing the Chasm and Inside the Tornado and Escape Velocity. And he was rolling out the book Escape Velocity. And in that book, he presents what he calls a framework of frameworks, his hierarchy of powers. And it really is, if you work with a company to understand how they fit in each of those levels and you use what he calls the HOP, the hierarchy of powers, you get one view. And I recall getting into an uncomfortable, for me, he was quite good with it, a little dialogue about, I think you need to look at things through a multiple sets of these different tools out there, Jeffrey. And here's the different tool sets that I use. I can't just use yours alone, as great as it is. And he actually ended up agreeing. So I was pleased by that. So
interesting. Yeah. Building on that, what questions have you seen be impactful with your clients when you think about this, like the challenge of getting them to focus on the right problems? Is there any specific or even just frameworks you've seen?
There are a couple of questions. Let's see if I'm fitting into it, or you can point out the error of my ways. One is, for example, an individual stepping into leading a new team. I encourage them at some point early in the tenure to sit down and ask the team the following question. At the end of our time working together, when we're successful and you're successful, what will you say that I did?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, to surface the path to success, almost behaviorally speaking.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
It has, some people are a little uncomfortable with it, and then they'll loop back with me and they said, Art, I was really uncomfortable about that, but I had the discussion. And once people got over the kind of momentary awkwardness, it was fantastic. So I have found that as a tool to get everybody to think about differently. And maybe it's not the classic reframe, but I think for some individuals, it reframes what their role as the leader is in that particular situation. They might have one view and the team might need something completely different.
I think it taps into something else that's very related to it, namely the ability to step back and reflect on your own behaviors or observe yourself in the moment. Like, we're just on autopilot most of the time.
Right.
And for good reason, because we're busy. What I found, people who are good at reframing, they have that ability to almost, take a little step back and think about, hey, how am I behaving right now? How am I coming across to my team? Or basically, there's Harvard professor Ron Heifetz who talks about this notion of stepping up on the balcony. Mm-hmm. Really, the idea of getting a little bit of distance. And to be clear, this is not about taking a week out of your calendar, going to a mountaintop and reflecting. Mm-hmm. This is about doing it as a momentary action in your day-to-day work. It really, a lot of the intellectual heritage of this comes back to Don Schoen, who worked with the concept of the reflective practitioner, of reflection in action. Really getting so good at reframing or seeing yourself on the balcony, if you will, that you almost can do it as a second nature thing. This should not be a formal process you step into. It is more a way of thinking that when you get to that point, it becomes really powerful.
So what does it take to go from picking up your book and saying, gosh, that really makes a lot of good sense, to be that comfortable and confident in that thinking approach on the fly?
Practice on small problems. I found, like, if you consider this, this can be good for your annual strategy seminar and you're going off somewhere to an offsite. Where this gets really useful is when you start thinking about it in all of the small frictions of problems you see in your day-to-day life. So look at your family dynamics. Like, you have a daughter that doesn't want to do her homework. Look at the situation with your neighbors, or with a co-worker is not doing what they should be doing, whatever. The more you start getting into the habit of just applying it to all those small problems and noticing when somebody finds a new angle on it, the more you start building almost your problem literacy, if you will, like the mental muscle you have that allows you to do it when it's really important. So
let's try maybe taking apart a problem that I hear fairly regularly. It's the individual dealing with that difficult, who they perceive as a difficult coworker. Might be a peer level who disagrees with them, who they need to gain support from or resources from for whatever reason. It's just, oh my gosh, I don't want to go have to talk to Thomas again. I can't stand this guy.
Actually,
joking.
Have you ever been in a situation where you coach people where you had both of those people as coaching them? Like,
Oh yeah, absolutely. I end up a lot of cases. In fact, oddly or awkwardly, and probably in violation of some coaching rules, I end up with a lot of bosses and subordinates, and I'm coaching both of them and listening to this, and I'm running into this very scenario. So how do we help that individual? Now, in this case, it's me, and I have to approach you no matter how much I don't want to, because I need your help. So how can I reframe, rethink? How can I jump over and make, what did you call it? Perspective taking? Maybe shift my perspective to you?
Yeah. So I'll share a couple of the strategies I have in the book. So I basically, through my work, I try to identify some pretty simple approaches that can be good when you're trying to reframe. And so one of the first ones is the idea of looking for bright spots. And a bright spot is really a positive exception. So if you always struggle to talk to me, except maybe there was one day on a beautiful podcast, where we suddenly had rapport. Right.
Yeah. Everything clicked. It just worked.
Exactly. And the question to ask is then, like, what was different about that day? If there's even just a glimmer of a positive exception to the otherwise tense relationship you've had with this person, there's probably a clue in there about what was different that you might be capable of reusing. Was it a different form of conversation? Did it start in a different way? Did you initially flatter them wildly before criticizing them? So that's one good rule of thumb. Another one I love is the notion of looking in the mirror, and that's the painful one. But it's really about asking, how am I part of creating this problem? We so often tend to say, I'm the innocent victim here. This idiot is creating chaos in my life. It's just so easy.
I believe we always say that, 99.999% of the time. Yeah.
And that's a very comforting perspective to stay in if you really just want to vent. If you want to make progress, you sometimes have to take a hard look in the mirror and say, what am I doing here? If my client or my coworker doesn't respect me, is there something that I do to create that reaction? If my team is not doing what they should, what's going on my leadership level skills that may need rethinking? That's just always a powerful question to ask.
And doesn't it help if we get some outside perspective on that as well?
You've probably tried this, right? Like talking about a problem with a friend or just somebody who's not involved in it, that can help tremendously, especially somebody who's maybe willing to prod you a little bit.
Right.
It's always a good measure when you think about the people in your life you discuss problems with, if they're willing to annoy you a bit, right? Because it's so easy as a friend just to lean into the positive, like,
maybe look in the mirror a bit. And I'm wondering, does it help to get that outside perspective to share with us as well, what we're really doing in that situation?
Absolutely. And you probably know this from when you sometimes have a problem, you discuss it with a friend who's not involved in it. That can be tremendously helpful. And also because if it's a good friend, they'll maybe be willing to challenge you a little bit. Like, it's always easy as a friend to kind of not push back and say, yeah, your boss is a horrible person. The most valuable friends you have are probably the ones that say, you know what? It sounds like you were being a little bit horrible that day too. And so getting an outsider to come in. So like the fundamental issue is we're often too close to our own problems to see them clearly.
Sure. So one of the things I do, Thomas, with my clients, and now I'm piecing some things together. You're helping me, thank you. As I actually encourage them to have what I term a swim buddy, and the swim buddy is from the United States Navy SEALs. And when someone is accepted into the training, you're put together with another individual who's literally for the entire training duration never more than 3 feet from you.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that can give you that frank feedback, that can tell you to work harder, move faster, do it differently. I kind of like that swim buddy, but they've got to be someone that can kind of give you a hard time.
Yeah, I think it's important, and I can point to the people in my own life that do that. I love them. I sometimes hate them a little bit, but I mostly love them.
They annoy the heck out of me, and gosh, I'm thankful for them. Yeah, exactly.
There's such a beautiful anecdote about Winston Churchill. And how one of the people on his staff is annoying him deeply. And you can see in Churchill's diaries, he's writing about this character and saying, oh, he's horrible again. he always just got into Churchill's face and challenged his ideas. And the question is, of course, who hired that guy? Well, Churchill did. Churchill knew that it was important to have somebody who is willing to get in your face, even though you're the boss in this context, or if it's a friendship too, somebody who's willing to challenge you. That's crucial. I love the swing buddy concept as well.
Yeah, it really does work. And it's that individual that can help you reframe or rethink or give you that feedback that, did you really want to get this outcome? Because that's the outcome you got. And what if you would have taken this approach or what have you? So can be really healthy. Sometimes hard to find somebody you trust enough to do that or who has the skills to do it, but worth the effort to find and develop a swim buddy.
True. Very true.
So one of the areas I spend a lot of time in, and many of my listeners are either in software development teams, or in creative teams of different sorts. So project teams working together. Yeah. And I think it's fascinating to think about this idea of reframing in those environments when we're trying to solve vexing problems that always show up in every single project ever. How do I teach a team how to reframe?
I'd say first, you have a couple of different jobs. The first one is just to make them aware of reframing. Like, and this could be as simple as sharing the slow elevator example with them, or whatever other example, just really to highlight what this is about. I'd say the bigger challenge is to train people a little bit in doing it, because what's weird about reframing is it's not enough to understand what it is intellectually. If that was enough, we would have known it since Einstein spoke about it back in 1938. The central thing you have to do is actually to take people through a couple of instances of reframing. Where I do it in my workshops, where I have people work on a personal problem they have, trying to reframe it with the help of a couple of other colleagues. You can take them through professional challenges you're dealing with. Ideally with a little bit of guidance around, hey, here are some good types of questions to ask. I think it becomes really powerful when you're there, because it is ultimately really difficult to do when you're just you. If you're the sole agent dropped into hostile territory and you have to do reframe all by your own, it's possible, but it's tough. Much, much easier if just a couple of the people around you understand what you're trying to do and know the terminology when you say, hey, is that the right problem we're trying to solve? They know what that means and why you want to have a conversation around.
Interesting. So back to our conversation, our dialogue on tool sets, I'm suddenly envisioning using one of my favorite tool sets, which is Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats approach to group discussion. Along with your reframing techniques and approaches. I just get I can't wait to try this, by the way. I think it will be a rich situation.
I found that, so de Bono's is a good example of a type of reframing in this, where you define specific lenses. Like the red hat is that's
emotion.
No, that's emotion. The black hat is a critical thinker.
Risks. What can go wrong, right?
Exactly. So that to me is powerful. What I've noticed here is something I asked the question, why isn't this more widespread, given that de Bono has talked about it, given that design thinking talks about it?
Right.
And interestingly enough, I think it partially comes down to almost the way we package these things. Because when you think about de Bono's methods, they're pretty straightforward, but they're often positioned as this very creative, flamboyant tool. Now we're going to go use a very creative method. And I found we fall into the trap of using that in workshops. So, when we have a 1-week design sprint, this is where we apply it, bells and whistles. It's fantastic. And then it fails the test of being useful back in the day-to-day meeting. Most of the companies I work with, they're not like necessarily as Silicon Valley ping pong tables everywhere. They're railroads, they are airlines, they're banks, And if you go in there and start with creative methods, that doesn't fit the culture. So to me, the art is almost, and what I try to do with the book on the method is almost develop a white label method that you can take that doesn't come with the Hawaii shirt included.
I love that.
I think it depends on the context, because there are places and situations where you can absolutely pull in the creative methodology. If you're working in an ad agency, that's like, you have to. That's part of your what you're selling, really. If you work in a different context, then I think it is very helpful to not necessarily be tied to calling it, hey, folks, we're going to learn design thinking now, or whatever it is.
Hey, it's time for the six thinking hats approach. So
yeah.
Do you know that I do almost a reflexive action? I facilitate with the six thinking hat style, never mentioning the hats. Yeah. Sorry, Edward DeMono. I don't recall if he's still with us or recently passed, but I often don't mention his name in that setting. But I'll use the technique and say, hey, look, we need somebody as a scribe, and let's capture what we're saying. All right, let's focus on everything that can go possibly wrong with this situation and so forth, and we'll work through it. Nobody will know that I was using six thinking hats. It's just a style of facilitating. So I think that's maybe your, a bit of a white label approach to that.
Absolutely. And I think the last step of that, in a sense, is to take out the facilitator. And I don't mean for high level, like important things that what you're doing with clients. When they come to you, they have something important to work on. There, you need a facilitator. What I want to achieve is an ordinary Wednesday afternoon where you're just you and your team, and you have a problem, and you have to find a little bit better way of dealing with it. So that to me is success.
Yeah, right. I mean, when the group is using that on their own without that extraordinary event, as you said, it's not the week to be creative and just doing that. I mean, so you've worked with many clients. Have you had feedback from clients that have kind of embraced this technique and incorporated it into their DNA? And what's that feedback been like?
Basically, it's something I think I've achieved mostly on individual and team levels. So there are companies that I work with that are now, it's part of the language. Mm-hmm. And it's not always, by the way, that they use reframing. Sometimes, depending on their culture, they may use different expressions about it. Right? There's one company where they adopted the language of saying hypothesis about problems. Like, what's your hypothesis about this?
Okay.
Just a little verbal hint to indicate, hey, this is not actually the problem. This is our hypothesis, our idea about what the problem is. So I think that's the types of success I feel I've seen. There are other companies where you see them start to build in a little bit almost structural support. So things like when you're submitting an idea, there are two fields. There's the description of the idea, but before that, there's the description of the problem you're trying to solve. And I'd say also some companies that start using it with more, they do in specific contexts. They go in and use like design thinking methodology.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I think that's a valid solution as well.
So, out of curiosity, have you had experience working with clients on strategy and the techniques that you have here in the book?
Less so. I have primarily not focused on CEOs. And why do I say that? I feel there's so much of our leadership literature that kind of assumes you're the CEO, or kind of you're close to being the CEO.
Right.
Vast majority of people, we're somewhere in the middle of the pyramid, higher or lower on the ladder. And all of my work has actually been focused on trying to figure out how do we help solve those problems. Because I think in some sense, I feel that the strategic problems, we're probably fairly far along at giving them a good deal of attention. If you want a recommendation for that, I really like the work of Roger Martin and Jennifer Reel as well.
The integrative leader.
Yeah, integrative thinking.
That's a great book. Yeah, great resource.
Creating Great Choices by Jennifer and Roger Martin.
Yeah,
they have a lot of really great cases about CEOs that did this, and I he's been doing a lot of work on strategic framing in general.
Sure. So it intrigues me. I end up with the management teams a lot in most strategy endeavors. Can I say this? Most strategy endeavors are, potentially gigantic tragedies in the making, filled with all sorts of biases and political perspectives and brinksmanship and very ill-defined problem, frankly, in many cases, and a lot of opinions. I probably just shot myself in the foot for ever getting another strategy engagement, but that's really what they're like. I think that your tools here, your approach, sorry if the word tools, but your approach here can be really useful in those settings. So I'll look forward to trying that on for size the next occasion, should I get beyond the commentary I just had on what most strategy engagements are like.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it is. It's powerful. I like as well. This is one of Roger Martin's questions. Especially at that level, you very often see people advocate for a specific solution.
Of course,
this is what we should be doing. Or we should acquire this company. And he has this question of basically what would have to be true for that to be a good idea.
For that to be right.
Which is a very elegant way of kind of unearthing the assumptions that this is built on and having a discussion about that versus the spreadsheet analysis, whether the comma is set in the right place.
Yeah, right. So I have to ask you, if you are able to, what's your favorite framing situation you've encountered in your travels? And of course, it has to be one you're comfortable talking about, not bound by confidentiality.
My favorite framing situation.
Yeah, framing, reframing. Yeah, put you on the spot.
Yeah, I will. I'll share two examples that just stand out in my mind. One is not in the book. That's basically a company that builds radars. And they are, when you build a radar, you're doing that for a governmental organization, and you get this long list of all the technical specifications you have to fulfill. What they did, beyond, of course, meeting those requests that allowed them to win the contract, was a very simple thing. They realized that if you are maintaining a radar, there's something like 40 different specialized tools you have to do for all of the existing models. And they just went in and said, you know what? That's not a problem that the client specified, but we're going to build this radar so you can fix it using two tools that you already have. It was, to me, it was such a powerful example because it was in a space. We sometimes tend to apply this to soft problems like leadership and so on. But this is very real for, you're building hardware, you're building solid, heavy industry things. And here's just an example of somebody who looked outside the frame and saw a user problem or need that nobody had really addressed.
That's great.
Another example. So now I'm starting off, but it's a historical fame. I love this is an old story, but the year we put wheels on suitcases, that happened in 1972. Mm-hmm. Or in other words, in the span of human history, first we put a man on the moon, and then we put wheels on suitcases. Like that.
What's wrong with that order?
Yeah, and that just, to me, draws out the idea that sometimes if you're trying to create something new, it's not about the technology. Mm-hmm. It's not about what the wonderful things your gadget can do. It is about seeing a problem that we're so used to that everybody else has become blind to it. Oh, wheels, suitcases? Maybe a good idea. I don't know. Then of course,
great example.
Yeah, and the personal ones stick with me as well. Like, you see this. I developed this in a business context, of course, but I immediately, the people I taught it to immediately started applying it to their home lives, and that's as you've seen in the book, I have a good deal of personal examples as well.
Sure.
The one that I love there is probably Tanya Luna. She's an author based here in New York, and her husband Brian. That they used great marriage, but they used to fight a lot over small things like the budget, who walked the dog, whatever. And in the beginning, she just went in and said, well, this must be about our childhoods and about our deep values and whatever. And that didn't help at all. And so at one point, they just, they noticed that they had actually had one positive discussion about the budget, which was Uber
that bright spot.
Yeah,
right?
The bright spot. And there was suddenly like, wait, how come we discussed it without fighting? And they suddenly just realized it was because it wasn't in the evening. Like, they had most of their fights after 10 in the evening. The problem was that they were tired and cranky like everybody else after 10 o'clock. And that led them to instigate this rule in their marriage, basically the 10 o'clock rule, that if somebody brings up anything contentious and it's after 10 o'clock, you say just, honey, it's after 10. and then you discuss it the next morning where everybody has more in it.
I mean, imagine all the incredible business advice we've received here. That may be the most valuable tip for everybody who's watching or listening. So yeah, that's a public service. We'll make sure to include an address where they can send contributions.
You can send a thank you note to Art for saving your marriages. It's kind of like
you know what my personal favorite one was, and I think it's maybe a nice area to kind of tie things off. I never thought of it, and I laughed out loud. My wife looked at me funny. It's like, what are you laughing at? It's a business book. It's like, it's really interesting, Allison. It was the one where the individual had a boss they couldn't stand.
Oh yeah.
This is almost as good as the marriage advice you just gave. So can you share that, please?
Basically, this is a story from Robert Sternberg, who's a big name in creativity research. And there's this executive who he loved his job. He worked in the auto industry, and he hated his boss. And so one day he had enough. He went to a headhunter. He said, "Can you get me a new job in the same industry? I love the industry." And the headhunter says, "Sure. There's a lot of appetite in the market at the moment. It's a great market to seek new jobs in." The same evening, he goes back, the executive, and talks to his wife. And his wife happens to be an expert on reframing. And they arrive together at a little bit better solution, namely not to get him a new job, but to get his boss a new job. So he goes to the headhunter. He hands his boss's CV to him and say, "Can you help find this guy a new job?" And he does. And the guy ends up being promoted into the boss's position. The boss has no clue like what just happened.
That is unbelievably brilliant. So
it's a beautiful example.
One we would never think of. And I think it's just a fabulous reframe.
It's so interesting. The difference it can make to have sometimes a 5-minute conversation, even with a relative stranger, about your problem, that can just, make you see the light. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it works.
So the entire book, What's Your Problem? To Solve Your Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve, is fabulous. It should be on every manager's bookshelf, something that's referenced every individual's bookshelf, particularly all of the teaming work that goes on. So I your passion for the work comes through both in our dialogue here as well as within the book. What did you learn about when writing this book? There's always a personal journey. These are labors of love. These efforts.
Very much.
What did you learn?
I had some shifts in my thinking in creating it, because in the beginning, since this is a topic we've written about for more than 50 years, I thought I had to share everything in there. Mm-hmm. That's the classic academic kind of go, "Oh, we must reference this too," and so on. And at some point I realized that's not the right challenge to solve for. The challenge to solve for is twofold. First of all, make it so simple that people can actually use it. And that required me to strip out a lot of stuff. And secondly, and this is maybe where the personal angle came in, but I just realized that many of the business books we have, it's hard to retain the knowledge. It's difficult to, you read about a concept, but not a lot of it comes out the other end into your actions. And so, as you've seen in the book, I actually use a lot of these visuals, very simple drawings, to illustrate the concepts. I found it makes such a big difference for people's retention of the ideas. And that was that was a journey I took together with Harvard in a sense, because they, they're a fantastic publisher. They were surprisingly open to it. I had honestly expected them to be kind of like, "What, you want to do hand drawings in the book?" Forget that.
Were those your drawings, by the way?
They are my drawings.
I literally have a talent. Them. You have another skill there.
I can draw lines and arrows.
You don't want to see my lines and arrows, Thomas.
Oh no, but like it is there's a little bit. I'm showing you now for those. If you,
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And if you can show the book from the cover, it's a unique. It's a unique trim size too. I'm actually always fascinated by that. That had to be a distinct decision. Why did you make that decision?
It was, and that all comes back to accessibility. My core purpose of writing this book is to democratize the ability to reframing, and so I wanted it to appear as accessible as at all possible. There's something about this format that a little bit says this is something you can use, and even to the level of the design. It would have been tempting for most designers to go in and say, "You know what? This pretty ugly hand drawing, I can do that in something that looks way cool." Yeah. And that's right. But that's alienating. Like
Right.
I didn't want the shock and awe feeling you get from really beautiful design. I actually wanted to give people the feeling that this is something they could do, like go in and draw for their team in the next meeting. And I think that was I just wonder why we don't do that more. There is a temptation to do these very austere looking heavy tomes, which is great for establishing legitimacy. But
Right.
if the problem we're trying to solve for is to make people use this, then that's maybe not the best way to write business books.
That may be the most brilliant insight from the whole process. And I'll have to share with you, this is, again, a little bit of guilt coming out. I confess a lot on these podcasts. Most business books, business tomes that you describe, I'll read the introduction. I'll read the first chapter.
Yeah.
And I'll read the last chapter. And then maybe I'll look at some of the content in the middle. But your format had me paging through, working through, looking at the summaries, thinking through the actions, loving the drawings, because they're somewhat, I can relate to those types of drawings, since although yours are still better. Practical, useful, and compelling were the words that I kept thinking of as I read the book.
Thanks.
So yeah, really, really, incredible job. Well done. And as I had mentioned, you're also going to get a reference on another podcast that I run with a well-known leadership blogger. And we're talking about our favorite books on thinking. And so yours, along with Roger Martin's, are going to be my submissions for that. So that's my gift back to you for your wonderful time here, Thomas.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's a pleasure. And I look forward to sharing with you some of my victories or my clients' victories in reframing in the future.
I'd love to hear that. Thanks so much, Art. It was a pleasure to be here.